This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Tigers are at risk of extinction around the globe. But in India, hard-fought conservation has seen the population double since 2006. While this is fantastic news, it does create new challenges to face, like how to manage poachers and negative encounters between tigers and animals kept as livestock and the people who live in the tiger's range. Artificial intelligence matched with innovative trail camera technology called TrailGuard AI by Nightjar may be the answer to not only protecting tigers in India, but other large carnivores around the world. Published in the October 2023 edition of BioScience, Mitigating Human-Wildlife Conflict and Monitoring Endangered Tigers Using a Real Camera Time-Based Alert System outlines how the new tech works and what implications it may have beyond tigers in India. Lead author of this paper, Dr. Jeremy S. Dertien, joins Defender Radio to share more about his experience working with AI and tigers, how we can see the solution be used in larger contexts, and what ethical issues need to be considered. Could you tell me a bit about yourself and how you got involved with, you were at a South Carolina university, I believe, and you ended up working in India with tigers. So I think there's an interesting little story there to get us started.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Of course.
So I was doing my PhD at Clemson University and working on a project actually based solely within South Carolina, or mostly within South Carolina. And at Clemson is what's known as the Tigers United University Consortium. So it's actually a consortium of 4 of the major tiger mascot universities of the South.
Sure.
And as you can imagine, those mascots in Southern U.S. Schools are pretty important to them.
Oh, yeah.
So it included University of Missouri, Louisiana State, Auburn, and Clemson.
Mm-hmm.
And so the purpose of it was technology exchange. And they also brought students over from tiger range countries to get their PhDs in America. And so I was a part of the technology exchange. We were working with a group called Resolve, who created this TrailGuard AI camera.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of previous camera trap work. So I worked in Alaska during my master's, and then I worked in California for the Wildlife Conservation Society on recreation effects to wildlife.
Very cool.
And so I was, partly right place, right time, also right, experience to deploy this camera for the first time in India. And so we were able to work with our partners. We worked with the Global Tiger Forum, which is an intergovernmental body for tiger conservation, and the Wildlife Institute of India, and we were able to deploy these cameras for the first time in India. So that was my connection to it.
Yeah, it's a very the mascots are that I do find that a little amusing, I'll admit, but it's a very exciting opportunity. And I was not too familiar with the issues facing tigers. Obviously, in North America, our biggest cats are about half the size of a tiger, which I looked up and was wondering about. And okay, they're a lot bigger. But yes. One of the big issues I understand from my brief research is that wild tigers are considered a population growth success at this point due to a lot of effort from a lot of different folks, NGOs, governments, individuals within communities to protect them, to create habitat connectivity. But now you've got a rebounding population of an apex predator, which in itself creates potential issues. Regardless of your philosophical stance, it's changing the ecosystem again. And humans in this era don't really do great with apex predators, based on my experience in Canada. So what kind of issues then are occurring within the communities in India where the tigers are coming back?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extremely complex situation. And with the tigers coming back, there's one of the biggest ones is livestock kills. So a lot of the villagers are having their 1 or 2 cows that they might have, or some goats, killed by tigers. And in some of the places that we were working, it was almost a daily occurrence where somebody's livestock was
Wow.
being taken. And it's easy prey for the tigers too, right? The cattle do not have any prey response to the tigers, or until it's too late. And so, and the other issues that abound with that is that the people are usually there walking often with the cows. And so then there can be collateral damage to some of the villagers as well. And after that, then there can be, it's thought that there's retribution killing because if most of your livestock in the area are being killed by tigers or you feel threatened, there could be that type of killing, and sometimes that's actually poisoning of the carcasses left after a tiger's killed a cow. And so the forest rangers will monitor those with traditional camera traps as well. And then there's also poaching from outside groups. So it's a pretty amazing, even though it took a lot to wrap my brain around the difference in the philosophy a lot of the local Indians that live around these tigers, because there's still this reverence for them. And so my colleague, Rashida Negi, who's the co-author on this paper, she interviewed over 600 people of some of the native tribes within our study area. And some of them lost their one goat that was that they needed for a wedding, and they still did not blame the tiger for it, even though it delayed things for years. And so it's an interesting balance between the reverence of the tigers, but then also the economic needs and life needs.
Absolutely. And we actually at the Fur Bears did a survey on Canadian perception of wolves and had a very interesting sort of situation where most people across most demographics view wolves as iconic. They want to protect them. They want to see them succeed and thrive. But there is a conception that they're responsible for a lot of depredation of livestock, which statistically there is no evidence of. And at that point, they go, well, it's okay to kill them then. And it's a very interesting divide. As soon as there's an economic threat, and again, in our case, it's very hard to quantify because it's not tracked in any meaningful way. But there was that philosophical line in the sand. And it sounds like, you're constantly kind of trying to find it in this area, because as you said, there's some folks who, even after they've lost something significant to a tiger, they still want to see these animals protected. They still want to see them succeed, which is remarkable, quite frankly, and wonderful in a lot of ways. But as you said, you then have poachers, and you have people who are going to go out and try and get the tiger that got their livestock, which creates other issues. And let's talk a bit about then the cameras, because right now, my understanding of cameras is they are growing as an effective means of research, period. We've got, in addition to that, I remember reading a study about using DNA that's been floating about in the area effectively to try and track wild animal movements. We've got, in Canada, we use fur catches, I know, as a great way to track movement. But these camera systems, particularly with various types of cellular activity or satellite technology, really do get you right into the habitat. Are you getting live feeds from this? Is this a system that's set up to trigger in a certain way? Or is that the role the AI now plays, the artificial intelligence processing?
Yeah, so I guess going back, if you think of what traditional camera traps do right now, is they take a photo, and if it's connected to cell, if it's triggered by heat and motion, and then if it is connected and can transmit over the cellular, it's sending every photo that it takes to you if you're using one of those. And so especially a lot of hunters out there that have used these, and researchers too, know that you can have thousands of, depending on the type of camera, thousands of false triggers. And so then you're getting these emails and notifications and all that. And so it becomes maybe an annoyance for a ranger if it becomes ineffective, if they're trying to use it as a warning system, because it's constantly crying wolf that there's something might be happening and it's a false trigger. So this TrailGuard AI camera is pretty unique because it has what's known as AI on the edge, which is each camera has artificial intelligence program working in it. And So it can decide, it can put a probability of a species. When it takes a picture, it can put a probability on that species being a species of interest. And so if it thinks it is a species of interest, then it'll send that photo to you with that probability, with other information. If not, it'll still store the photo, but it won't send it to you. And so that's one of the bigger game. It's also extremely small. And so the receiver is separated, and so it can be very well camouflaged. So that's where it comes in very useful for poachers. It's really like the camera itself is about the size of one of those large Sharpies, like extra large Sharpies. And so it's meant to be up high. It can shoot kind of at a downward angle, and the AI system will still work that way. And so ideally, the less people know about, the better, because then you can catch poachers. And so, yeah, so our partners at Resolve, where can now be used over satellite connection as well. So, but we were testing it over cellular.
That's incredible. And I imagine the artificial intelligence that has been sort of programmed into these is looking for specific variables and goes through sort of that algorithm list of dichotomous questions of, is it bigger than X? Is it longer than X? Is it, if you're using heat sourcing, does it register at this temperature? And sort of then does AI's math magic, which, you know, I'm still working on long division, so we'll just presume that there's a bit of math going on. And from that, it then spits out the yes, probably your target, or no, probably not your target. And is that more or less the...
Well, and they actually Resolve worked with a software company that developed, does this image visioning, and they created these 3D models, 3D illustrations of the different wildlife that they've deployed the cameras for now.
Cool.
So the cool thing about that is, you know, we train AI off of photos that already exist or text that already exists. If you're able to have a 3D model that's hyper realistic or realistic, you can then put it within different types of environments. You can put it in different lighting conditions, and then you can do it from all different types of angles. And so they're able to train it even before they're getting the photos that we got for the first time from tigers. So that's how they're initially training the model, and then as they get more photos, they can train the AI model to be even more precise.
And the real-time notification aspect of it is certainly, as you've noted, significant. What kind of applications then are you seeing it being used for with this project specifically? You know, the headlines are about coexistence, but you've also mentioned poaching. Are there, like, what are the applications being used for specifically in that way?
So as first is more of a first warning system. So some of these tigers, some of the cameras we're putting up were about 100 meters from villages, from village homes. And we were seeing tigers just walking right on, pretty much on the other side of a small canal from these areas. And so these are going to rangers who can decide then if that tiger might be a threat and they need to intercede in some way. And then also it's being used in other parks that have more of a poaching issues, because especially within a tiger reserve itself, there shouldn't be people just wandering around. So in those circumstances, they can tell, okay, that's a person that's not supposed to be there. That's not one of our guards. That's not one of our rangers. And so they can go and intercede because they're likely there for illicit reasons. When it comes to the human wildlife conflict, which is what my project was focused initially mostly on, it becomes a lot more complex because that they might know that tiger is wandering there every day. And so the ranger needs to make a call if they think it might be a problem or might be heading into the village itself.
And then they would be able to utilize a range of options, as you noted. So is this a go in and try and divert or haze or use some kind of adversive method, or is it go in and, okay, this is a repeat offender, we need to have a broader conversation, maybe even a landscape management solution, I would imagine at times.
And it's with this new type of technology, it's also, and we hit on this on some in the paper, is that it's opening a whole new realm of research from multiple angles, both social sciences and wildlife research and traditional wildlife biology research, because it's including the locals within active management, and trying to prevent conflict with them too. So trying to preserve their livelihoods and obviously the conservation of the endangered species.
Well, and it's interesting because traditionally wildlife management focuses on the animals. In North America, we have the North American model of wildlife conservation, which is focused on game species almost exclusively. Right. And it has a lot of gaps as a result. Whereas it sounds like this is a much more holistic look of humans are part of the ecosystem and the tigers are part of the ecosystem and we both need to be here. How are we going to make that work? As opposed to we need to do this to get the tigers to do Y, for example.
Yeah.
Which again is a very, I don't know, it's new to me, but I imagine that is perhaps not new to have that kind of a focus at this point.
It's definitely moving more that way in several countries. It moved that way in India a little while ago, where it went to a recognition of the need for community engagement for this as for the long-term conservation, because in the early 2000s and late 90s, it was really an emergency for tigers. They were at their lowest levels. Yeah. Worldwide, there was somewhere around 3,000 or less in wild across their entire range, which is from Western India to into Malaysia, and there's only 3,000, less than 3,000 of them, where there was about 100,000 in 1900. So it took some major action and preservation of new areas to get them to rebound for the first time, increase in for the first time in 120 years. But now there's, like we talked about that there's now success with the population rebounding, but that means more potential for conflict with humans.
No, it's really great though that there is this sort of adaptive view of it of, okay, we have now protected the species to a point where recovery is possible. How do we ensure the long-term sustainability of this population at this point, now that the landscape is so much different with human impact than it was, like you said, at the beginning of the 20th century? It's almost like colonizing stuff turned out poorly, but we won't get into that.
Whole different podcast, right?
Oh, yeah. So talking about the technology, ease of use comes up in the article in BioScience, and I thought that was very interesting. I grew up as a very techie person, just enjoying playing with new things and seeing how they work. But I'm also very familiar with the large part of our population that struggles with batteries and a remote control. So you note in this paper that actually was an important aspect of the development of this, was keeping it simple.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And that's, Dr. Dinnerstein, this is his, he's seen this through from working with the inventor of the technology for the last 7 years. He's formerly the global scientist for World Wildlife Fund for 20 years. He knew that for this to be successful, and he really fused this as the ultimate piece of technology for conservation of endangered species, it needs to be useful for people from all across the world and from all different educational backgrounds. And so being able to bring it out of the box and pretty much just plug it in and give some instructions via an online platform or emails or something like that was really vital, because a lot of the times the people that are asking for these cameras now are in near emergency situations for conservation of their species. And so they need something that's, really applicable, useful, and then can be used to, especially for the poaching situations, to used quite quickly to get into a camouflage positioning.
Yeah. And I note too, where a cell connection is available, this AI system can transmit on a single charge an average of about 2,300 JPEG images, text files containing metadata on battery levels, probability value of detected object, etc., and still allow for about 1,500 to 2,000 false trigger events recorded to an SD card but not transmitted. That alone is, I mean, I burned through 8 batteries in a weekend trying to see how many raccoons are in my garden on my $50 trail cam. So clearly there has been some advancement of the technology, perhaps out of my price range, but it has certainly advanced.
Yeah, and they're trying to keep, and they're actually trying to, for at least for conservation organizations, trying to keep this about the same or even less than some of the nicer camera traps as well. And it looks like they're going to succeed. They're working with a production company in India, and so most of the cameras are going to be produced in India for use in India and Southeast Asia.
Awesome.
And that was another aspect. Like the battery needs to last for long periods of time, because the less in poaching situations, the less you need to go out there and check it, the less it's going to get compromised. The location is going to get compromised, or the less people need to know where it's at to work on it. So that was a major aspect.
Yeah, and looking at the paper, which will be linked in the show notes, there's figure 4 for folks who are looking at it. You scroll down and you see it looks like what CSI was doing on TV several years, or more than several years ago out, but a while ago. And the technology didn't really exist at the time, but it's framing, identifying person, tiger, person. Like it's very it's neat to look at, period. But I can imagine then for law enforcement, for a local biologist, for everybody, how exciting it is to be able to get these alerts, like you said, sent to them immediately and then be able to act. What has the reception been like for the communities where this is being deployed?
So far, there's been, a lot of interest, especially, we were able to employ one of the villagers from the area. We asked the village head if he could recommend somebody. And so we've been employing somebody for the last over a year. And so they continually ask for other. They've been asked for other deployments in the area, and they've been working with the rangers. They all have like WhatsApp groups that they are kind of, or the village head at least can talk with the rangers. So for the most part, it's been positive as we've seen, and there hasn't been any damage to the cameras either, and which as
excellent
probably couldn't be said for putting up maybe where I used to work in Colorado or so, if just putting up cameras with nothing on them.
Oh yeah, I have spoken with enough researchers who have done more often urban related wildlife monitoring, but they burn through cameras because they just get kicked, they get spray painted, they get stolen. There's very little you can do about it because, as you said, you don't want to be going to it frequently. You want to leave it and only get it when you need the data. Is there concern? And this is something we talk a lot about at the Fur Bears when it comes to wildlife data. Is there a concern that this could be used for evil purposes? Could poachers get their hands on this and then make use of it? Or could those who otherwise maybe want to affect or exploit animals?
Yeah, it's definitely a question I get, and Eric gets a lot. And they are very controlled with who's getting these cameras. They're very, to just conservation organizations right now. So that's all. The cameras itself sending out the signal is very rapid. So it goes into a hibernation mode very quickly. So it's hard to detect it if you have a sort of electronic monitoring. And so it's, part of it is the secrecy of where the cameras are being located, and then there's also you need to be working with Resolve and the group coming off of them to be able to program these cameras for your operation and to get the notifications coming from them. So they've definitely thought about that. It's definitely a concern because some of the technology is already there for poachers to use, but this is the next step. And so, it's been a slow rollout because of some of those concerns.
It's always good to take your time and be a bit cautious with that kind of stuff. If anything, we have learned from Skynet not to rush new technology. Now, I'm curious, long term, do you think this can be applied? So again, speaking in Canada, we do have large cats. They are not as large, but cougars in British Columbia, for example, they are very frequently killed by conservation services for approaching communities or for spending time in a community. And it is I believe, based on the idea that there aren't very many options from their perspective to keep the cougar out of the community. Once they're in the community, there's not much to be done. So in that context, could a system like this then start being used in other, for targeting other wildlife, for targeting communities in different places beyond these very direct conflict sites that we're talking about in India?
Yeah, yes, it's definitely possible, and they already have models developed that pretty much can detect and send for any large felid. And so I think already for mountain lions, the models are there to deploy these cameras. There's also the connection. There's development now of connecting with different technology to try to scare the animals away as well. So if you connect it with different types of maybe a speaker system that can play different things so that the animal doesn't get used to it, or a flashing, some sort of flashing or things like that. In the case of elephants, there's the famous that they really don't like bees. So if hooking up the camera to actually open bee boxes to, in parts of Africa where they're destroying crops, where elephants are destroying crops, there's things like that. So that's an extreme case, but with mountain lions, yeah, it's definitely there and possible.
Yeah, and it is really cool to think of linking it up to the other systems, like you've said. I have looked at a lot of. I've not yet done any solid research or spoken to anyone on, but they're called predator eyes. I believe it might be a trademarked one, but the concept of the flashing lights in an approximate distance of a predator's eyes. So that, and I don't know that would work with an apex predator, but certainly with mesopredators and stuff and livestock protection, it can be effective. And I think too, as well, it gives a lot of research options too. That'll be very exciting, as opposed to trapping, attaching a collar to or tagging and then releasing an animal. A system of these cameras would allow you effectively within a habitat to track those movements without ever needing to interact with an animal.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. And part of the issue with that is the use of cameras on like you typically are putting the cameras on trails because that's increasing your ability to detect the animal, right? But it helps. Some of that coloring data can help with determining how wildlife are moving and the health of the animals sometimes, and overall reproduction of certain populations. So it definitely can take the place of parts of it. It can help with monitoring, especially the real-time aspect of it, where you're not having to wait 3 months and then go through 2,000, 3,000 camera trap images. But it's a balance of the different technologies that we have, I think.
Yep, that makes sense. Always kind of growing and learning. Now, folks who want to learn more about this kind of stuff or who have an interest in it, and again, I'm thinking in some of the more urban areas where we're seeing encroachment from urban sprawl creating a draw for wildlife. So in North America, as you know, coyotes are spending more and more time in urban areas because we are taking away more and more habitats, and they adapt quite quickly to urban areas. I could see this being very valuable in some areas for something like that, where it's okay, we don't need to do anything per se, but it's good to know if animals are coming in on corridors. Or again, thinking, I interviewed Parks Canada folks a few years ago talking about wildlife passages they created, the under highway corridors. And it was the exact thing of, well, we sat and we looked at about 8,000 images after, like 6 months after it had all happened. And the ability to get those notifications as you go and then see an alarming trend or see something, again, people in a wildlife passage greatly affects the dispersal of animals. It really just, it creates opportunity to intervene before problems escalate, I think, is sort of what for me feels very exciting about it.
Yeah, and we use some of the some terminology in the paper talking. Just this is somewhat of a paradigm shift of going from the passive use of this data to the active use of this data, and so we so often, like you said, are for things like wildlife corridors that are vitally important for connectivity, wildlife connectivity. Having active information for that can quickly change how we're doing the management of species. And if it's if you're waiting 6 months per se to actually be analyzing any of these data, that could be, well, like you're saying, well beyond the time that is useful for actually either preserving that species in the area or capturing an offender that shouldn't be in a place that they're often going to.
Yeah, it's exciting for you, and for I mean, you have noted that you are working on a connectivity pan European connectivity project.
Yes,
I'll get there. Is this something that you see, though? I mean, having been involved in the project, do you see it rolling out, like, realistically into various other things? And as you're working on corridor connectivity and things like that, finding uses for it, or is it going to be one of, like you noted, very slow and steady release, limited to specific conservation units? Or is it going to be the next big thing that really does cause a paradigm shift in how we manage and how we research and so on?
Yes. No, it's going to be, no, I mean, I've been involved working with this camera now for almost a little over 2 years, I guess. And part of what kept me going and excited about it was I saw the same vision that Dr. Dinnerstein saw in the ability for this camera to really work, especially for protecting endangered species, both from a poaching standpoint and the human-wildlife conflict standpoint. When it comes to deployment, so like you said, I'm working, I now live in Germany, and I'm working on another postdoctoral fellowship modeling ecological connectivity across Europe. I think for the camera itself, it's still needed immediately in places that have some of these critically endangered apex species or other ungulate species that are endangered. And typically that's not within North America or Europe. And so I imagine, I know it's more work is happening in other places in Southeast Asia as well. And it can also be used for other criminal activity as well, like illegal logging. There's models for logging trucks, and cool. So it can be used for those types of aspects, which also feeds criminal organizations as well. So I think when future deployments, it's still a little slow, but they're definitely picking up a lot, and especially in some of those areas that are definitely needed the most.
Excellent. Is there anything I didn't cover that you want to get in on this?
I guess, there's the ethics of it, which camera traps often, and I don't know if you want to hit on that at all. That's typically the comments that come up, and it's actually some Twitter pushback we got.
Really?
And it's, with camera traps and wildlife biology, it's something. There's been papers that have come out talking about the ethics of cameras in the woods and things like, and different types of monitoring that we do. And there's definitely sensitivity, and more sensitivity now being taken with the data that is being collected. This takes it to the next step, where it's real-time monitoring. And so I think that's where it's important that the organization Resolve is staying with the people that are working with these cameras. So, in communication and in collaboration with whoever's deploying them, just because it's needed for a mission, but that community engagement needs to happen, because especially for human wildlife conflict, there's the ethics of having these in and around people. And so it's an important conversation to have. But that's why the data is being tightly controlled, and only certain people are being allowed to get those notifications. But we'll see going ahead how the conversation evolves.
And that's fascinating as well, because right now, or in the past few years, particularly during the pandemic, there was that influx of security footage, right? People getting their doorbells in urban areas and cameras and all of this. Like I said, I've been monitoring wildlife around my garden in the backyard, so I can develop strategies to keep them from burying stuff among my vegetables. But there are then conversations where a city might say, you can't have it on your front door because you are capturing people on the street, which is a violation of privacy. or could be a violation of privacy. And it is an interesting ethical question. And the fun thing about ethics is there aren't right answers per se. But it sounds to me like there is a lot of thought going into that already. And again, the sort of keeping it within the community, keeping the data within the server and those who have been given access to it very specifically will go a long way, I think, in protecting that. But it's a broad question that I think has implication far outside of this application that we're all still struggling with as well, living in a more surveilled nature. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And I'm hopeful then in the next few years as well, we'll hear more about how communities have adapted to it. Because I think that, the species conservation is clearly, and reduction of conflict are clearly the goals. But the sociological aspect of it is going to take time to play out. And that'll be a really interesting thing to look at, is how did the communities adapt to this? Did it provide them a sense of security? And did it lead to a clear reduction in negative encounters?
Yes, absolutely. And then that's part of this, with this this initial deployment, we created both engagement programs for the rangers. So I was there presenting about connectivity and about how the camera works and about deployment of them. And then we also created a community engagement module that had multiple posters that were translated to talking about tigers and interaction with nature, and then what the purpose of these cameras were for, and how the community could help as well. And so I really think the team really thinks that's necessary to have this kind of holistic approach instead of just putting cameras out. It's really getting in front of those things and really including the community from the beginning is super important.
I want to thank Dr. Dertien for his time and encourage everyone to check out his research and other writings on his website at conservationdertien.com. Links to the study discussed and other articles are also available in the show notes for this episode in your podcast player or at defenderradio.com. I also want to thank you for listening and sharing this episode on your social media channels. It goes a long way in getting the word out, helping the show grow, and really just making the world a slightly better place. Remember to tag @FurBears or Defender Radio when you do share. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.